Any questions about the meditation practice before I get into tonight's topic? Jay?
What's the sort of Buddhist take on interrupting a meditation to write down like a really great idea?
Do you do it sometimes?
Yeah.
Are they?
Well, sometimes you don't. Sometimes
Yeah.
Try not writing it down.
Right.
See if it sticks around.
There's different schools of thought probably about it. I don't think that the Buddha addressed it that I know of, but it's not an uncommon question. You've been meditating for a long time and are committed to it. So my encouragement for someone like you is sometimes jot it down. Interrupt your meditation and jot it down. And then sometimes don't. So part of the school of thought is if it's really brilliant and important and insightful, it will still be there. You won't forget it. Because part of that is attachment, right? It's like, I don't want to forget this. I want to hold on to it. And part of our practice is let go, But sometimes it's okay to do it, or after the meditation, to probably still going to be there in 10 minutes when the bell rings, and sometimes don't write it down. I don't think it matters that much personally. I mean, if you're really going for concentration, it's going to break your concentration to stop and write something down. But if you have a regular practice and every once in a while you take a note during your meditation, no big deal.
I think the problem maybe for me is that meditation becomes something that opens up creativity. So it becomes a time where I'm like having more thoughts than I might, creative thoughts than I might usually. I can't really stop every day.
Right. And especially if you're doing first foundation, where you're trying not to pay attention to your mind, and those thoughts are just taking your attention away from the stabilized attention in the body. Then I would say, really don't give too much energy to them. But then when you're doing third foundation of mindfulness and you're observing your mind and you're impressing yourself with all of your brilliant creative thoughts that are coming, sometimes take some notes. I mean, I had this experience where sitting a long retreat and I would write down, and sitting a long retreat and I was in the middle of writing a book. And so my mind kept saying write this in the book and write this in the book. And then so I wouldn't do it during meditation, but after meditation, sitting sessions, sometimes I would take some notes. And then after the retreat, I looked at them and most of them were garbage. But they felt so brilliant at the time. They, I was really I have to remember this. And most of them didn't make it into the book and weren't, but there was a couple that were really good and did make it into the book. So, I don't know. I don't think we need to be too uptight about never do that, but probably don't always do that. So in a series of the core teachings of the Buddha, the Four Noble Truths, we're on night 3 tonight, which is the third truth. Anybody who's not familiar with the first 2, these are a sequence of the Buddha's experience of what we are going through and how we can get free. And he starts with the first truth, the acknowledgement, suffering is normal. Dukkha is the word. Everybody experiences it. Nobody has an incarnation without dukkha, without some suffering, some stress, some difficulty, loss, grief, sorrow, comes with the package. Second noble truth, the main cause of our unhappiness, our sorrow, our suffering is this repetitive craving for life to be different than it actually is, usually focused on if it could be more pleasant than it actually is. Craving for sense pleasures, craving for pleasure, or craving for permanence. And we suffer a lot about that. Wanting things to not end, wanting things to last longer than they last. Or the other side of the craving and the clinging, which is, I want this shit to go away right now. I want it to end faster. This is painful. This is difficult to bear. So, first truth, normalizing the difficulty of the human condition. Second truth, acknowledging that there's a cause. It's not what's happening that is causing our suffering. It's how we're related. It's the craving for it to be different that is causing our suffering. Which is it's pretty radical. Usually we go around saying like, no, I'm unhappy because this is happening. We don't go around saying like, I'm unhappy because I'm aversive to what's happening, or I'm attached to what was happening. We rarely take responsibility for why we're unhappy. We're usually saying like, no, like this is blame. And Buddha, kind of turns us back to, nope, take full responsibility. Craving is the cause of suffering. Craving, clinging, aversion. Third noble truth, where we are tonight, is the good news that it is possible in this lifetime as a human being. Now, this is the teaching. I'm going to go full televangelist here. In this lifetime, through your own efforts, to experience the end of suffering. You, through your practice, your ethics, your renunciation, your meditation, can experience nirvana. This is the promise. This is the third noble truth. Not some mystical future rebirth, be a good Buddhist and have 1,000 more rebirths and then you can get free. This is one of the radical things that the Buddha said. He said, no matter what your karma is, you can get liberated in this lifetime if you do the work. You can experience happiness, you can experience freedom, you can experience nirvana. Nirvana is the end of what's causing our suffering. Greed, craving, clinging, hatred, aversion, manipulating, trying to control, and delusion. And much of the delusion is the delusion of a permanent self, of self-centeredness, of I, me, mine mentality that our mind produces all by itself, but nirvana is seeing through that. I'll share with you some of the classic one of the ways the Buddha talked about his own path. He said, before my enlightenment, while I was still only a lowly, unenlightened bodhisattva, being myself subject to birth, aging, ailment, death, sorrow, and defilement, I sought after what was also subject to these things. So reflect on that for a moment. Being subject to sickness, aging, death, and defilement, I went through the world seeking after things that were also people, places, things that were also subject to sickness, aging, death, defilement, impermanence. Then I thought, why, being myself subject to birth, aging, ailment, death, sorrow, defilement, do I seek after what is also subject to these things? Suppose, being myself subject to these things, seeing danger in them, I sought after the unborn, the unaging, the unailing, the deathless, the sorrowless, the undefiled supreme release from bondage, Nibbana. Just a sort of like, oh, maybe rather than still looking for happiness in all the wrong places, what if I actually look for it in something that's not the conditioned? I know that I'm in a conditioned body that craves and is subject to impermanence. What if I seek freedom outside of that which is subject to impermanence and craving and loss and sorrow? And when he got there, he started to refer to Nirvana as that which is the exhaustion of greed, hatred, and delusion is called Nirvana or Nibbana. This truly is the most peaceful and refined. That is to say, the stilling of all formations, the forsaking of all acquisitions, clinging, acquiring, and of every substratum of rebirth. No more ending the cycle. That's why we call it the deathless. No more taking birth into this form. Liberation. The fading away of craving, cessation, Nibbana. The remainderless fading, cessation, Nibbana, comes with the utter end of all craving. Now, in some of the commentaries, they start to conflate desire and craving. It says the end of desire. These are suttas that I'm quoting from, the kind of earliest recorded teachings. And they're using the term tanha, craving. And I think it's important for us to wrap our minds, our unenlightened, our lowly, unenlightened bodhisattva minds. You know this term bodhisattva? In later Buddhism, they turned it into like a magical being. But in early Buddhism, the Buddha referred to anybody who was committed to waking up, who was on the spiritual path, who was dedicating their life to wisdom and compassion, a bodhisattva. That was the definition, was I'm seeking, I'm on the way to, I'm a bodhisattva. Now, in later forms of Buddhism, they turned it into a vow to postpone your enlightenment for the benefit of all beings. A bodhisattva is somebody who says, I'm not going to take final liberation until everybody gets free with me. I'm going to come back and help everybody over and over and over. And this was a later idea, but he refers to himself as a lowly, unenlightened bodhisattva, like it's not a great thing to be. Not a Buddha yet. This distinction between desire and craving, I think, is necessary, because the promise here is you can end craving completely. Craving, in my mind, is the thought, the feeling I have to have. I need. I have to have it. I can't be happy. I can't be satisfied. I can't relax until I get it. It's that compulsion, that craving. Desire is, sure, I would like to have something pleasant happen. I'd like to enjoy something pleasant, but I'm not obsessed with it. I'm not craving for it. It's just a desire. Desire is take it or leave it. So when this promise of the remainderless cessation of craving, it doesn't mean you won't have normal, healthy desires. It means you will no longer be obsessed with the delusion that you have to have. Make sense? So we'll go on for a minute and then we'll explore it a bit. Basically, over and over, different ways of saying the end of greed, hatred, and delusion. But here's a really cool list. I don't know how many are here. Over 30 different ways that the Buddha refers to nirvana, to liberation, in the suttas. the end, the taintless, the truth, the other shore, the subtle, the very hard to see, the unweakening, the everlasting, the disintegrating, the invisible, the undiversified peace, the deathless, the supreme goal, the blessed, safety, exhaustion of craving, the wonderful, the marvelous, non-distress, the naturally non-distressed, nibbana, non-affliction or unhostility, the fading of lust, purity, freedom, independence of reliance, the island, the shelter, the harbor, the refuge, the beyond, the endless, the cessation of suffering, the freedom from longing, the uncreated, the beyond, deliverance, cessation, the absolute, the law, the deathless, the lasting, release, liberation, total completion, freedom from bondage, stillness, purity, allayment, the unborn, the unoriginated, freedom from lust, the destruction of the passions, the unconditioned element, the standstill of the cycle of existence. So all of these different ways and different contexts where the Buddha was quite clear, I only teach, everything that I teach is about getting people to this. When there's a often quoted saying that the Buddha said, I only teach one thing, the truth of suffering and how to end suffering, the end of suffering. And so all of those are ways that he talked about the end of suffering. So we're born into this situation that is difficult. And we don't naturally know how to skillfully respond to it. Life doesn't come with a how to develop compassion manual. Very few of us got those teachings from our families of origin. Life doesn't come with, we're not naturally wired to be non-attached. We're born into this situation where clinging and craving and attachment, suffering is our birthright. Nirvana sounds fantastic, but how do we get there? And of course, this is where we start next week, the Eightfold Path, where a life of mindfulness, a life of renunciation, wisdom and compassion can lead to this experience of not suffering, breaking the habitual reactive tendencies that cause suffering. And I think that reactivity is an important thing to think about here, an important way to frame it. I think it's actually more realistic to work on being less and less reactive to the human mind, to your body, to the world. When we know, right, when we know that our suffering comes from how we react. It's not what's happening. It's craving for it to be different than it is that causes our suffering. It's aversion to the way that it is that causes our suffering. It's greed, it's hatred, and it's all of this I, me, mine, self-centeredness, delusional belief in a permanent self, taking everything so personal. So a lot of this third truth is experienced, like in the meditation tonight, I said, just let go. Let go of the past, let go of the future, let go of needing the present to be any different than it is. If you can do that just for a moment, and do you have moments when you're doing that in your day? In acceptance? That's a moment of nirvana. All of those moments where you're not craving for something to happen, aversive, resentful, all of those moments where you can just accept life on life's terms. Right now, it's like this. Now, maybe it's not fully nibbana, because often with that experience, there's the feeling of like, I am at peace. Or I am, there's still a lot of self-identification with our mind and our body. Not always awake to emptiness in those moments of non-clinging and non-aversion. But there is still often not much suffering. Many experiences of nibbana. Now, what happens for you when you have a moment in your day when you're not suffering? Where does your mind go? What do you do with it? Either we cling to it and ruin it, or it's not that interesting, so we crave for something more interesting. Like, not suffering, whatever. How about something pleasant? I wasn't looking for peace. I was looking for bliss. I was looking for joy. I was looking for an orgasm. Something more interesting than just, I'm not suffering right now. Big deal. Stephen Batchelor is framing this, and I like it in one of his new books, as Nirvana is becoming non-reactive. The end of reacting with greed. The end of reacting with hatred. And the less reactive the more responsive we become, responding rather than with greed, with non-clinging, letting go, generosity, non-attachment, no suffering. Rather than hatred, responding with compassion, forgiveness, not reacting with the old instinctual drives, but a wise response to even the most painful, difficult, challenging experiences we have. This is what our practice, a skill that our practice teaches us, how to respond more wisely. And we see, I'm clinging again, and we let go. I'm resentful again, and we forgive. Non-reactivity leads to happiness. Now, of course, we have to make a choice. We have to respond. But it's pretty easy for most everyone to have the humility to say, my reactivity causes me stress. I don't have a natural tendency towards compassion for unpleasant things. I have a natural aversion to unpleasant things. I don't have a natural non-attached, let go attitude. I have a clinging, craving tendency. That's just the human condition. It's not your fault. It's not personal. But it's not very fun. Or we wouldn't be here, probably. We have to work at it. We have to train our minds to see more clearly, to respond more wisely. It's not going to happen all by itself, and not from talking about it and not from reading about it, but the work you're doing on the cushion. Present time awareness. We see the impermanent. And you turn towards your mind and you start to see how impersonal it is. And you stop being so identified with it and taking it so personal. The mind is just not a very wise place. It just doesn't, it's just not filled with love all of the time. The mind is filled with, sometimes it's love. I hope you're having some loving, kind, pleasant thoughts, but all of that self-centeredness and fear and survival instinct that the mind needs to have and has makes life so challenging. So much suffering when we believe it. And when we believe it's who we are, and when we believe it's our fault. So nirvana possible in this life. Now, that's the classic teaching. Now let me talk some shit. Because I don't know. I like it. I like that there's this big promise that says you can do it and you'll be able to do perfectly. And then here I am, 30 years in practice, and then I know most of the teachers, and have studied with people that have been doing it for 60 years and the monks that have been doing it, and none of them seem to be perfectly enlightened. And I'm certainly not, obviously. So then there's some question about why does the tradition set it up as kind of easy? Oh yeah, you'll just get enlightened. And then if you read the suttas, in the time of the Buddha, people heard one Dharma talk and the immaculate vision of the Dharma arose in them and they were liberated and arahant. It's one, just like Stevie, one Dharma talk. Done.
Stevie got it in one Dharma?
Yeah, he did. So, I feel like there is some question about religion setting up a perfection. This perfectly enlightened, the remainderless cessation of all forms of difficulty and or craving, clinging, causes of suffering. I've met people that are supposed to be enlightened. It's hard to tell if somebody's enlightened from the outside because it's such an internal, what is your internal relationship? But I feel like if somebody is unkind, that I feel like one of the traits of awakening would be awakened beings would be kind. And I feel like for me, and maybe that's some sort of westernized emotional psychobabble, trait that I'm assigning to it. But for me, it feels like if somebody was awake, that they would be kind and loving and friendly and some of the Buddhists that I've met that are supposed to be quite liberated are very kind of stoic, not very friendly and kind of quite almost dour. I'm like, liberation does not look that good on you. And then you get somebody like the Dalai Lama who's giggling and I think looks like, yeah, I want to hang out, I want to party with that guy. But then he says, I'm not liberated. He said, I'm still suffering. I'll be honest with you. Now, a lot of the Tibetans think oh no, he's totally just pulling your leg. He really is liberated. But he says, I'm not. Thich Nhat Hanh says, I'm not. These guys say, even after 67, however long they've been doing it, they say, I'm not in nirvana all of the time. I don't suffer that much, but I'm not there all the time. Where I land is, I don't fucking care if perfection is possible in this lifetime or not. What I know for sure from my own experience and watching so many other people is we make progress and suffering decreases and happiness increases and peace increases and reactivity decreases when we practice these teachings, when we apply them. Do we get to be fully enlightened Buddhas? I don't know. It doesn't seem like it. Either we're all just doing it real half-assed. I know I'm doing it half-assed, but I don't know about the rest of you. But I feel like some people are doing it full on, the monks that are doing it full on, and decades in, they don't seem to be fully liberated. But I'm sure that they're way happier than they used to be. And that's enough. You know, in 12-step program, they say progress rather than perfection. And I like that. I want to make progress. I want to be more kind. I want to be more generous. I want to be more wise, more, maybe not, maybe it won't be perfect. Maybe we won't be perfect in this lifetime. But who cares? Who cares? Maybe that is religious exaggeration. The perfect cessation of all forms of greed, hatred, and delusion. I'm still in, personally. And I hope it's not disillusioning to anybody to hear me say, I'm not so sure about this full liberation in this lifetime. But this is the teaching. The traditional teaching is Nirvana, the deathless, full awakening. You won't have to come back ever again. And then there's the people who say, but I want to come back. I like existing. And maybe that's true. And then you can take the bodhisattva vow. If you're a bit attached to existing, take this vow to keep coming back until everybody's free, which means forever. Because everybody's not getting free. I like the Zen version of the bodhisattva vow, which is, beings are numberless. I vow to save them all. Suffering is endless. I vow to end it all. I like it. It's got a sense of humor to it. The ridiculousness of this situation we're in. What are your thoughts about Nirvana? Please.
I really appreciate your honesty now. I think one of the premises that I would question from my own life is that one's life condition does not lead, I wouldn't like the word happiness because that sounds like a really charged word, but satisfaction. Because if we were all driving to Compton right now and sitting in a little beaten down hall in Compton and hearing you were in a shabby trail and there were gunshots outside or it was dangerous, we'd be a lot less satisfied than we are sitting here in bourgeois West Los Angeles, Marina Del Rey, right? Or if we had to
Come on, Venice, all right, come on. Marina's like a block away. We're still in Venice over here.
Marina Del Rey's for Jack Daniels. That's been paid no more. Okay? So let me give you an example. You went through some of this, and you had experiences. I went through 5 years of litigation against me and my wife. I had to move. I have a family. My child was unsettled, acting out in school because he had to move around a lot. There was a lot of displacement. So that created a level of unhappiness for me and problem in my thinking. How do I solve this? My wife was unhappy. 4 lawsuits against me, right? Kind of like what you went through, right? I got like 3 hours sleep a night, with anxiety. Suddenly the lawsuits are ending. I have a business now that's successful. I'm sleeping like 7 hours a night. My life conditions have changed. And it's not that my mental focus about how I react to those conditions have changed. The real conditions have changed. Yeah. And it's not a level of greed. Oh, I got to get a Gucci. Oh man, I need a new car, man. I'm not like that. I don't give a shit about that. Mm-hmm. So what I care about is a level of stability for my family and myself. I don't have to move to Inglewood. I don't have to move to East LA now, right? And this may be some of your experience, you can address it, but from my experience, that leads to happiness. Not happiness forever, not enlightenment, but happiness. And so sometimes I walk around and I go, oh, I'm not really good because I'm really happy now. Oh, I'm happy. That shouldn't matter. Of course it matters. And the older you get, and I'm getting older, the more wisdom I have. But looking back at my life when I was 30, I wanted the thrills. I wanted to go out and booze it up and get women and all that. But it depends what life cycle you're at. But as you get, like the Buddha in an older life cycle, you go, oh, I have more wisdom. I'm going to die. So what's important is love and the relationships I have with my family. And the more they're settled and the material conditions lead to safety and satisfaction and food and health care, the more they're happy, the more I expect to spend time with them and my child.
Of course, but you're talking about the ordinary human condition. When things are difficult, we suffer and we don't sleep well. And when things get better, we are happy and you're talking about the happiness based on conditions. And of course, that's the normal way of human life. If things are really difficult, and then we're unhappy and we're suffering and we're stressed out. And when things get better, then we have some security and we feel better. This is the core of the Buddha's teachings. And we've been through this before. The core of the Buddha's teachings is it is possible to be at ease in any circumstances, no matter what's going on. If you've practiced diligently and deeply, if you had done lots of meditation for the 30 years before all of that litigation hit you, you would have had a different experience of going through that than you did.
Well, it's an assumption. You say you haven't done that, and you haven't met anyone that's done that. So what gets me with the Buddhist teaching,
I'm saying perfect.
It's one thing to say it's important in life to have what you're talking about. But it negates that. It says it doesn't matter what happens in your life. That's the Buddhist teaching. And that would, for me, is hard to accept as a truth for me. Yeah. To say it doesn't matter.
Well, you're absolutely right. That is
better with that, but I'm saying it doesn't matter. If we all would say it doesn't matter what happens in my life.
It's not saying it doesn't matter. It's saying human beings have the potential to navigate even the most difficult things. Not that it won't be painful. I said there's a difference between craving and desire. There's a difference between pain and suffering. The Buddha is saying the end of suffering is not reacting in an unskillful way to the pain in our life. I am the first to say I don't know anybody that can do it perfectly, but I know for sure my experience of the difficulties of my last couple of years my relationship to it drastically different because of my Dharma practice. If I hadn't had the Dharma practice and the ability to respond rather than react some of the time, most of the time, I would have suffered a ton with litigations and all of the stuff that I've been going through. So I have direct faith, and I know you do too. You've seen how it works in your life. And we can let go of the perfection model and just say, it'll help. This shit will help. Judy, please.
What you were saying, so in my personal life experience, I went through a really bad thing with a marriage, and my husband relapsed completely crazy, and it was before I found meditation. And those first 3 years, there's, Buddhist thing about shooting the second arrow. So I was suffering like crazy, but my thoughts were shooting the second arrow. So I was in hell all the time. And when it first started happening, I had a really comfortable life, and I had money, and I didn't have to worry about it. And 4 years in, I was broke out of my mind, but I'd started meditating. 6 years in, I had zero money, and I was happy a lot of the time. And I wasn't shooting the second arrow all the time. So I wasn't not sleeping 3 hours a night in turmoil. So for me, I'm super grateful for this practice, because was I still sad? Was I still lonely? Did I still have resentment, regret? Yeah, but I could let go of a lot of it and didn't turn it in on myself anymore. And okay, then I didn't have money, but I suddenly found my basic needs were met. So I had a roof over my head. I had food. I wasn't going to be homeless. So those things I think are necessary for most people, a basic level of happiness. But for me, I found the practice took really painful, really dreadful situation and made me be able to have happy days and happy moments and be at ease, even while honoring, I'm sad, I miss this. You know, I mean, I was married for 30 years, you know, I felt the guy was my best friend. And he went crazy. And so it was like, did I have loss? Yeah. You know, did I mourn that? Sure. But after doing this practice for a while, I don't know, I wasn't beating myself up. I wasn't tormenting myself every minute of every day. And the money thing, you know, like now I have a lot more money than I did 2 years ago. I don't know that I'm discernibly happy. And I'm a counselor and I have rich people and poor people, and I can tell you some of the really fucking rich people are fucking unhappy. You know, and they've got it all. I mean, by our standards, they've got it all. And they're miserable. And I know some super poor people that are couch surfing, don't have a house of their own, who have a whole lot more ease and balance. So, you know, I don't know. I mean, I think I get your experience. I understand that's your experience. You know, I'm just saying, for me, the practice has made me have a different perspective to those kinds of experiences.
So just a request to bring it back to the third noble truth and how, you know, questions you have about the teaching or experiences you have with this teaching. Please, Stevie.
Well, I was just, you know, I had a recent teaching with Thich Nhat Hanh, and he was saying that he does this twofold thing where he takes his anger or his pain or his sadness and he cradles it like a baby in his arms. My little suffering, my little misery, my little hatred, my little, you know, pain. And that's like kind of twofold, bringing awareness, but also not resisting, but also being tender to it. Mm-hmm. And it's a waking up thing. And I agree with what she was saying, because when I came to the cushion, it's only 13 years, I was richer when I came and way unhappier. And now I think that sitting on the cushion has opened my eyes more to the most simplistic of beauty. The exchange with a person, a child, a bird, my leaf, my home, the lighting, the smell. I just don't think I noticed how much sweetness there was. And I'm happier now from 13 years on the cushion, with less money, but happier than I ever was. I'm not well. I don't know that I will ever be. But then when we all know about all these great names we can drop of all the great teachers, and we see how far they've gotten. And they're all still newcomers. As far as I heard people say they've been on the cushion 40, 50 years and they're still learning. So that's cool to me. I don't want to stop. I know that I'll never be wherever there is. It's just now and a little sweeter now. A little tiny bit of sweeter now. But the cushion has brought tremendous change to my life that never happened before. I sat on the cushion. There was no change. Hitting my head against the wall. The same thing. And it's very slow. Oh God. I'm so grateful for it. Which also is a component of happiness. To accept and be grateful.
Absolutely.
I don't know if that's off the teaching, but it's just my experience.
Okay. Thank you. Rona, please.
Cushion's an interesting as well. I was curious, you know, with your experience, do you notice that the more intense the gravity of the situation, you know, that you perceive, is that sort of inversely proportional to the level of calm that you have to bring to it? So if you could feel that something's pretty intense and maybe even sudden, you have to take it slower and more on a calmer frequency, say, than your experience.
I don't know. Probably, but I don't frame it that way. But what you're saying makes sense. Probably, yeah. If it's more intense and calls for more patience with it and tolerance of it and compassion for it.
Versus just complete detachment. Always detached toward Nirvana. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the end of Nirvana in this lifetime is the ability to be in excruciating pain without hating it. Being an enlightened being doesn't mean that you're not going to have conflict and heartbreak, and betrayal and loss and aging and death, and doesn't mean that all of the most difficult things are going to not happen. They're going to still happen. And it's going to experience physical pain, I think emotional pain as well, but you're not going to suffer about it. This is the teaching. It's not that all of a sudden life is going to be pleasant all of the time. You're just going to have a wise relationship to all of it. And like the way that we're framing it, which is progress towards a wiser relationship, and several people sharing about like their experience being like, yeah, it's getting better. Please.
Yeah, Christopher, I was literally reading the 12 and 12 before I came in here with all that where they talked a lot about self-centeredness and pride and money, sex, and all that. And it seems like there's so many similarities between that and sort of the path to Nirvana. And this may be covered in one of your books, but I'm just curious about your perspective.
Of the intersection between the 12 steps?
Yeah.
There's a lot of universal truths that you'll find in the 12 steps and in Buddhism and in different spiritual and religious traditions that are just sort of like universal truths. Some of the 12-step perspective fits pretty well of the, when they're calling them defects of character, it sounds a little personal, where in Buddhism they're called hindrances, where it's just kind of part of the package. It's not a moral failing or a defect of you as an individual. It's just part of being a human being. You have craving and aversion and self-centeredness and fear, and those aren't because you're defective. They're because you're a human being. And they're not because you're an addict or an alcoholic. They're because, you have a nervous system that craves. And so, it's a little bit different, the kind of philosophical bent of why we are the way we are. Buddhism is humanist psychology that's really just looking at the organism and the process of how we function without, and talking about the karma of what's happening, where the 12 steps are very much Judeo-Christian theology, it's really, and which is laying this whole other thing onto us of like, we were created by God, and we are self-centered because we're not surrendering to God, and we're powerless because only God can restore us to sanity. And, so there's ways in which the 12 steps are so Christian in their worldview. And, Buddhism is so Buddhist in its worldview. It's much more a humanist psychology. There's no theism in Buddhism. So big differences on some levels. And the solution, pretty similar. Pray, meditate, be of service, practice generosity, help each other, get out of your self-centeredness by being, like the functional treatment, pretty similar. Of course, the 12 steps say, pray and God will remove this from you. We say, like, pay close attention, be mindful, and you'll learn to respond more wisely. There's not a magic sort of removal, but you'll get more and more skilled at not getting hooked into the cravings. And, that I've been doing both paths for 30 years. And obviously I like Buddhism better. But I still go to meetings and I still, participate in that world because that community, those are my people. Please.
Well, I've experienced recently a major betrayal by some family members. It's around an estate and trust, and these are family members that helped for years, and it's just an about face, and it's really shocking. So I learned from you this concept of equanimity, right? So mental calmness, composure, and evenness, especially in difficult situations. So I'm, meditating, I'm trying to practice that. But what I'm finding recently, and I really need your help with this, is that I'm fantasizing about getting revenge. I'll never go through with it, ever. But I'm like Googling, like how to report disability fraud, and like I want to expose them because I want them to feel pain and be, you know what I mean, like
Yes.
pain out there.
Yeah.
And you said one time that there's a really great prayer about letting something about heirs to the karma.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you could help repeat that.
That's the equanimity phrases,
Okay.
which is everyone are heirs to their own actions. And their happiness or unhappiness depends upon their actions, not my wishes for them. So that helps us, and it's about acceptance and about not trying to control and manipulate. Now, it's tricky, though, because, yes, everyone has their own karma, and sometimes we do need to hold each other accountable. We don't want to go around playing karma police and, judging and kind of, there's way too much of that going on in our world. But sometimes, in a situation, we don't want to use our Buddhist practice to become complacent when there's actually an action that you need to take. Not the retaliation, revenge, I want to hurt them, but like maybe I need a lawyer. Not just be like, oh, well, I'll just let go and just let them rip me off.
And I just hired one.
Yes.
Best decision I made.
So taking the wise action internally, retaliation, normal that your mind does that, but it's just suffering. So we disengage from it, come back to the present, return to the body, return to the breath. We replace the thoughts start doing forgiveness for them. And the equanimity, understanding the karma by trying to rip you off or whatever it's doing, they're creating a misery for themselves. Nobody gets away with anything. And so it's like, we've got to be responsible, take the next right action, and don't suffer about it as much as you can internally, but do the right things externally. Right? Do what you can. We are just about out of time. Monica, last one.
Were any of the people that you said that you met that were enlightened, like, you called it something before and I can't think of what it's called, but living like a normal life?
Householders?
Yes.
Well, most of the ones that I'm thinking of were some level of renunciates, of monastics. And then there is a guy that I know that calls himself an arahant, that calls himself a liberated being, who's, like, from my perspective, fully just a neurotic, delusional person, and he's a householder. There's I'm mostly referring to like the gurus and the monastics and what usually happens is there are the people that say I'm liberated. But usually what happens in the Buddhist monk world is it's when they die, then everyone was like, oh, they were so liberated. My teacher was, so enlightened.
Well, I feel like it's like how you said, like the I, me, mine. For someone to say I am enlightened, like how does that?
It seems like that, but the Buddha was doing it.
Yeah.
The Buddha was. I'll end with this. And who knows what, how much of this is. But he was constantly going around saying, I'm a fully liberated being and you can get liberated too. And that was the core of his teaching. I can't find it anyways, we're out of time, but yeah, it would seem like you wouldn't go around bragging about being awake, but if you really were awake and you had no self, it wouldn't be coming from an ego place. It would be coming from a just kind of like, I just want to let you guys know this is possible. Thank you for your practice, for your reflection. Consider these things, reflect on them, find out for yourself what's true, one of the things that I love about the Buddhist teachings is that there's this quality of see for yourself, find out for yourself. You don't have to believe it. It's not the kind of religion where it's like, and you have to believe this. It's okay for me to sit up here and be like, I'm skeptical about some of this too. There's an invitation to skepticism, and you get to find out for yourself and kind of take what you like and leave the rest type of situation. Class is done. Buddhism has been taught for thousands of years, in our tradition anyways, without charging money for it. Traditionally, there's just generosity. You go and you want to give to the monks and the nuns and the teachers, and people are just generous. You don't even have to ask. Some would say you shouldn't even ask. I shouldn't even have to ask you guys. You just know you're here, you give. But since where there's a sort of education, there's sort of an education process in the West, because we don't, part of our capitalist world is that often we don't value things that we're not charged for. And we don't get, if something is free, it's free. And we're just like, cool, it's free. And so class is not free, but there's no charge for it. And the way that this meditation center and me as a teacher are supported is by your voluntary desire to be generous, to want to have a meditation center and to want to support meditation teachers. And so people say, well, how much? You give what feels good to give. I started suggesting, $15 to $20, what you would pay for a yoga class, or this day for a movie, or, whatever feels good to you. If you're broke, one of the reasons we don't charge is because if you're broke, you're welcome anyways. You don't have to give anything. You can be here. We don't want money to block people's access. But also, to be honest, I'm struggling the center's not paying for itself. I'm actually supporting the center, and I don't have actually a lot of money to do that. So your generosity is very helpful to pay for the rent on the room, keep the lights on, as they say. So please be generous. If you can give $15 or $20, great. If you can give more, please be generous. The 501c3 will be coming, and then your donations will be tax deductible, and you'll be supporting the organization and get a tax write-off, but not yet.